Out of 380 flamethrower operators deployed on Iwo Jima, only 18 came out of the island alive. They had a life expectancy of just 4 minutes on the battlefield, but they were described as the best, and at the same time, the worst weapon US Marines had there. But their story is far more horrific than it seems, and now you're going to see why. When people talk about the Pacific War, they usually mention places like Guadalcanal or Okinawa, but Iwo Jima was a different kind of fight altogether. The island itself is only about 8 square miles, sitting in the middle of the Pacific, between the Marianas and mainland Japan. But in 1945, that small patch of volcanic rock became one of the most valuable pieces of ground in the entire war. The Americans wanted it because of its location. B-29 bombers were flying missions from the Marianas to hit targets in Japan, but the route passed right over Iwo Jima. That meant Japanese radar and fighters based there could track and intercept them. Even more importantly, if the US took the island, they could use it as a forward base for fighter escorts, emergency landings, and for launching shorter bombing missions with heavier payloads. The Japanese, of course, knew all of this. They had no illusions about the importance of Iwo Jima, and they fully expected an American invasion. But instead of meeting it head-on at the beach, like they had on other islands, they decided to approach this one differently. They studied the previous battles, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and they learned that surface defenses didn't work. Naval artillery and airstrikes would destroy a major portion of them before the first wave of troops even hit the beach. So this time, they went underground. General Kuribayashi was in charge of the defense. He was an experienced officer who understood the situation perfectly. He knew he wasn't going to win. He didn't even expect to survive, but his goal was to bleed the Americans for every inch of ground and delay their advance toward Japan. He figured that the longer Iwo Jima held out, the more time Japan had to prepare for the inevitable invasion of the home islands. American intelligence estimated no more than 13,000 Japanese defenders were on Iwo Jima. However, they underestimated that number by almost 10,000. And to make matters worse, nearly all of them were dug in. Over 11 miles of tunnels had been carved through the island's soft volcanic rock, which made excavation relatively fast. They built bunkers, pillboxes, machine gun nests, artillery positions and storage areas, all connected through underground pathways. Kuribayashi also had every inch of the island pre-measured. Artillery positions were already zeroed in on the likely landing beaches and strategic positions. Firing lanes were laid out to overlap and cover one another. There were no front lines in the traditional sense, just a network of positions that could support each other from different angles, with fallback routes below ground. When the US finally launched the invasion on February 19, 1945, they did what they always did. The operation began with days of heavy shelling and airstrikes. Battleships and cruisers pounded the island with everything they had. By the time the first wave of Marines landed, the entire coastline looked like it had been completely leveled, but almost nothing had actually been destroyed. As the first wave of Marines hit the shore, they found themselves trudging through loose volcanic ash, basically a deep layer of black sand. It sucked in boots, stalled vehicles, and made it nearly impossible to dig in and make cover. However, as the waves of Marines were landing on the beaches for nearly an hour, it was all quiet. No gunfire, no resistance. Marines were trying to get organized and move up the slope and inland. But then, just as the beach was packed with men, Kuribayashi gave the order. All at once, machine guns, mortars, and pre-sighted artillery opened deadly accurate fire. The result was devastating. Marines were hit in clusters, packed tightly on beaches with no cover. They suffered tremendous losses, but somehow, over the next hours, the Marines pushed inland, inch by inch, taking heavy casualties the entire way. And that's when they began to realize just how bad things really were, as they began to understand the defensive maze around them. Bunkers were cleared with grenades and satchel charges, but only one weapon could more or less effectively do the job. That's when the flamethrower came into play. You see, every time they thought they had cleared a position with explosives, Marines would move forward and Japanese troops would reappear and start shooting from behind. They were using the tunnel system to move under the Marines and pop up again in areas that were already supposed to be secured. Losses mounted fast, and fighting was just chaotic without any clear lines. The biggest problem Marines ran into again and again were the pillboxes. These were hardened concrete fortifications with machine guns, small firing slits, and overlapping fields of fire, positioned so they mutually protected each other from different angles. Some were so well hidden that you could walk right past them without realizing it, at least not until they opened fire. So to effectively clear them, Marines had to crawl or rush under fire and either toss grenades or satchel charges inside. But that was easier said than done. First, you had to survive long enough to even reach the pillbox. Then, you had to find an opening that wasn't covered by gunfire. And even if you got a grenade in, a lot of these pillboxes were built in a zigzag shape, so the blast wouldn't reach the whole interior. So just blowing one up didn't always mean the job was done. Now, the flamethrower became one of the only weapons that could deal with them effectively, but it also came with a heavy price. To understand why using a flamethrower on Iwo Jima was such a nightmare, we need to take a look at how it actually worked. The M2 was a standard flamethrower used by US Marines in World War II and even after. It had two large tanks filled with thickened gasoline and a smaller center tank of compressed nitrogen to push the fuel out. Connected to it was a long metal tube with an electric or white phosphorus ignition system at the tip to light the fuel. But here's the thing, your effective range was only about 20 yards, and a full tank gave you about 7 seconds of fire in total. That meant short controlled bursts, a second or two at a time, and then you were out. You had to somehow get to the pillbox within hand grenade range and use your 7 seconds of fire as best as you could. Then when empty, you had to go back to safety. Now, once the whole front saw your bright and loud fire stream. Japanese defenders knew exactly what a flamethrower would do to them if they let him come close. So the second they spotted a Marine with a distinctive huge 3-tank backpack moving forward, they gave it undivided attention with whatever weapons they had. The rest of the squad tried to suppress the enemy with rifle and machine gun fire to keep the flamethrower alive long enough to get in range. But with 70 pounds of gear on your back and well-constructed defences, it was everything but an easy thing to do. Being captured alive was perhaps a bigger fear than being shot. Because of their nature of taking someone's life in probably one of the worst possible ways, flamethrower operators weren't treated like regular prisoners. Execution on the spot if captured might be the best option you could hope for, but usually it was something different, much longer, and significantly more painful. There's one story from Iwo Jima when a flamethrower misfired as the Marine approached the cave entrance. 2 Japanese soldiers rushed out, grabbed him, and pulled him into the cave. The rest of his squad could hear him from that cave for 2 full days, unable to help him or at least end his misery, and we could only imagine what was happening to him. So everything with this weapon was terrible on so many levels. From the extreme danger of the weapon itself, as sudden wind or malfunction could turn it against its operator over the enemy, all the way to the psyche of surviving operators who had to live for the rest of their lives with what they did. At that distance, you'd pretty much see, hear, and smell the consequences and effects of your weapon on enemy soldiers. While doing research for this video, I came upon some photos and videos on the internet showing the aftermath of flamethrowers on Iwo Jima. And if you have a strong gut, you could find them to see what I'm talking about, although I strongly don't recommend it. Sometimes, operators used a tactic called a wet burst. They would fire a few quick shots without using the igniter, basically soaking the target with fuel. Then, they'd follow it up with a lit burst to ignite everything at once. It increased the chance of completely neutralizing the bunker without anyone coming back later. In confined space, the stream of flame would immediately raise the temperatures to 2000 degrees and consume all oxygen. So even if soldiers inside weren't directly hit by the fire, they had a slim chance of surviving. Looking at a flamethrower firing on video gives nowhere near the actual impression of how loud and violent it really is. Even the operators were trained to take a long, deep breath before firing, as they couldn't breathe during the firing. But even with all those risks, flamethrowers were one of the only tools that actually worked on Iwo Jima. Still, with casualty rates that high, the Marines needed something that could carry that weapon into battle with a bit more protection and more capacity. That's when they brought in the tanks. These were M4A3R3, modified Sherman flame tanks. Instead of a main gun, they were fitted with a flamethrower system. They looked like regular Shermans from the outside until they fired. They now carried around 300 gallons of thickened fuel and could fire flames 3 times farther than the M2, up to about 100 yards. These flame tanks operated in coordination with infantry and regular tanks. But the same as with the handheld flamethrowers, once they opened fire, the whole front would concentrate on them. And carrying hundreds of gallons of fuel inside a metal box was not what tankers found interesting to do, as if they didn't already have enough risks. However, flame tanks were definitely the most effective weapon on Iwo Jima and played a major role in capturing the island. If you want to hear more stories like this, help us out with subscribing.